Hello and welcome back. It is your host Weep Union with the latest developments across the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this update, we start out in the southeastern outskirts of the city of Krasnoyarivka, west of Donetsk city. We see that the Russians have managed to capture the final parts of the Dacha area to the southeastern parts of the city. Dacha area is some sort of small vacation area where standalone homes have small farm areas, most commonly used as vacation homes. These standalone areas are much easier to attack for either attacking side, as it's very difficult to fortify these areas other than using trenches, which are already used in the eastern parts that the Russians have already passed through, but they're also very difficult to hold on to. So until the Russians manage to gain proper footholds in the regular Soviet residential areas with the high-rise buildings here in the eastern parts, where the Russians would have the ability to gain a proper foothold, we already see that they have a presence within them which has allowed the Russians to expand their zone of control on the southeastern outskirts of the city. But the Russians need to gain a proper foothold by capturing the fortifications and high-rise buildings in the area to gain a proper foothold and start advancing within the central parts of the city. There's also the fighting in the southern parts where there's been no update on so far, which can indicate that there is no significant breakthrough by either side. The Russians are attempting to gain a foothold, the Ukrainians are attempting to prevent that, and we're seeing that so far no foothold has been reported since the Russians were first pushed out, which means that the Ukrainians have full control over the southern parts, and in the eastern parts fighting continues with this small advance, which was geolocated with this picture here, which confirms the Russian presence and advance within the city. We then move on to the next section of the front line, where we see here to the northwest of Avdiivka, the Russians have managed to advance within the central parts of Semenivka, gaining control over the central parts of the village. It is likely that the Russians have control over both of these fortifications, despite no visual confirmation of that, as Russians would not be able to reach the central parts of Semenivka without gaining control of these fortifications, as they would be very difficult for the Russians to pass through without control of them. I had previously left them as a grain zone, as the Russians could have passed through to the central parts and continued contesting over the fortifications, but reaching the central parts of the village means that they definitely have control of them, otherwise they would not be able to hold on to their foothold. With this, we see that the final parts of Semenivka is left behind. The Russians have control over the northern and southern parts of Semenivka, indicating that there's no supply line for the Ukrainians in the area, meaning that they would either be forced to withdraw or surrender or fight till the last man, as Russians will look to gain control of the final parts of Semenivka, allowing the Russians to gain full control over the eastern parts of the second line of defense of the Ukrainians west of Avdiivka. With this, the fighting intensifies in the northern parts as well, north of Berdishi, with the geolocated footage confirming further Russian advances northwest of Berdishi towards Novobakhmutivka. With this, the Battle of Novobakhmutivka will begin ahead of the fighting reaching Oshiretine. With this, we see that the main focus of the Russians right now is to push towards Keramik, Novokalinove, and Novobakhmutivka in the north, towards Umansk, Yasnoprodivka, and Nitailove in the south. The Russians are currently attacking the flanks following the capture of Berdishi and now the final battles of Semenivka beginning. The Russians are now focusing on the northern and southern flanks of the Ukrainian fortifications and defenses. The Russians will look to gain control over this junction between the two river lines, as well as Nitailove to gain full control over the southern flank, before pushing on northwest through Umansk and to the third line of defense of the Ukrainians, ahead of the western parts of Avdiivka. In the northern parts, the Russians will look to gain control over Semenivka before pushing on to the Ukrainian fortifications in the fields, heavily bombarding those, and then focusing or redirecting their efforts and focus to the northern flank, which will be around Novobakhmutivka, Novokalinove, and Oshiretine to the north. The Russians will here look to fight through the fortifications, gaining control of them, especially here in the southern parts of Novobakhmutivka, before moving on to the villages and fighting towards Oshiretine. Oshiretine is similar to Chasiv Yar in the sense that it is the high ground, heavily fortified fortress of the Ukrainians in the area. If the Russians manage to gain control over Oshiretine, they will have the operational fire control over the third line of defense of the Ukrainians, as well as the northern direction towards Konstantinivka. The Russians will have a significant advantage over the fortifications located here to the northeast of Oshiretine. the villages here, Kalinove and others along the northern parts of Zhytomyr. This all adds up to the Russians gaining a significant advantage in the area, and they will look to take control of it, which would secure the northern flank of Avdiivka and allow for the Russians to develop further operations, whether it be in the direction of Pokrovsk or Konstantinivka to the north. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here to the west of Ivanivsk, the Russians have made a small advancement along the forest patch, gaining full control over the fortifications to the east of the canal west of Ivanivsk. With this, the southern flank of Chasiv Yar is under Russian control, and they'll now be able to fight over the final battles over the forest patch here to the south of Chasiv Yar, allowing them to then start the battle over the crossing across the canal line. Zooming in, we see that there is this area here where the Russians can cross over by the canal. There is heavy Ukrainian fortifications along this crossing, both in the southern and northern flanks of it and throughout it. With this, it will be a heavy battle for the Russians, as the Ukrainians will try to hold on to it for a very high price, as the Ukrainians, after losing these fortifications along the crossing, will allow the Russians to cross over and start the battle over Chasiv Yar on the west side of the canal. The Russians manage to cross over the canal and gain a foothold across. The Battle of Chasiv Yar will begin for real. In addition to this, heavy fighting continues in the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar, as there's reports of the Russians launching assault operations into the eastern parts, and fighting also continues on the northern flank as the Russians try to solidify their control over Bohdanivka and expand it both in the northern and western directions. Fighting also continues along the railways as Russians are looking to push through it to gain access to the forest patch west of Bohdanivka. The Russians are looking to gain access to and control of the northern forest patch, similar to the southern one, as they will look to gain access to the crossing in the north as well. If the Russians gain control of both of the flanks and both of the canal crossings, they will be able to start the Battle of Chasiv Yar from both the northern and southern direction. In the meantime, heavy bombardment continues all over the city, both on the eastern and western parts of it, as the Russians are trying to bombard everything out of existence, which would allow them to just move through freely. Due to this and the recent developments with the recent Russian advances showing that they are able to continue their offensive operations without any breaks, we do see that now more than ever, the Ukrainian side is hoping for aid from the United States. Here, there is news on that. The United States Senator Schumer says congressional party leaders reach consensus on aid to Israel and Ukraine. However, something to note from this article is that it's overly optimistic. The main points of the article is that the Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that the United States President met with representatives of both houses of Congress on Sunday. Schumer hopes this week something can be done to help both countries. He did not specify what bill he was talking about, but called for the adoption of one that would be approved by the Senate. Apparently, there's also some kind of alternative document which was discussed at Biden's meeting. Yesterday, one of the Republican congressmen instead announced that the issue of Ukraine will begin to be resolved this coming week. However, at the same time, Speaker of the House Representatives Mike Johnson has so far only confirmed the solution to the Israeli issue and not the Ukrainian one. The thing is that unlike Ukraine, which mostly the Democrats support, while due to Trump, the Republicans are more laid back and refuse to help Ukraine, the Israeli issue is supported by both the Republicans and the Democrats. This means that it is very likely that they will come onto a deal with Israel before that they agree on something with Ukraine. So far, the Democrats have delayed aid to Israel due to them wanting to group together the aid with Israel with the aid to Ukraine. However, it is unlikely that this will continue as the situation in the Middle East intensifies with the issues with Iran and its recent strike with Israel. If that situation escalates, then it's likely that the US will send aid to Israel, bypassing the aid to Ukraine. The Republicans know this and it is therefore unlikely to make a deal with Ukraine as a compromise to hurry up or speed up the deal with Israel. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. And have a great day.